G'day, Paul from Small Crown Productions here. Welcome back to the channel. Shakespeare talks a lot about alcohol in his plays, and one of those alcohols is mead. In this video, we are speaking with master brewer Ian Vowles about all things mead. Let's go.
So mead is a wonderful alcoholic beverage made in its traditional form with honey, water and yeast and nothing else. But because mead itself has been around for a very, very long time, there are some of the things in Viking sagas that talk about mead, and it comes right up through to modern day. People have tried adding just about everything to a mead, and the fascinating thing with mead is that there are names for almost everything that's been added in terms of it's not just mead anymore. So as soon as you add herbs and spices, you get metheglin. As soon as you add some fruit, you get melomel. Unless, of course, the fruit is apples, and then it's Caesar. Unless the fruit is grapes, and then it's Pymot. And so you get this wide variety of names that are associated with honey, water, and something else. And this opens up a field for the brewer that is just magnificent. I really enjoy making mead. I've made a lot of mead over the years. I've been making some metheglins more recently that are particularly tasty. And it's a wonderful, wonderful drink. So the ones I've been doing recently, I've used ginger quite a lot. And once again, my sort of reference book that I keep going back to because I find it easy to read, which is published in 1652, it has a recipe in there with ginger and rosemary, and that was a particularly tasty drink, so I did that very much. I did it, tasted it, and did it again straight away. It was really good. I have done others where it's just had ginger and cloves and hops recently, and that's another very tasty drink. So it gives you something reminiscent of modern beers, but with a twist. Right, so the cloves are a little bit sharper in flavour and almost provide a little bit of heat. Right, and the ginger the same. Really very straightforward, because if you are just going to make mead, all you need is honey and water. So the proportion for the honey to the water can help you adjust the sweetness, and it can help you as a result adjust the alcohol content, so you can make very low alcoholic drinks that are very tasty with less honey, more water. All of these, because they're brewed drinks, require some sort of source of yeast. So you can leave it open to the air, or you can add something to it that might give you some kind of yeast. It's not unusual for people to refer to the use of barm, which is something where they had kept a little something from a previous batch that had brewed successfully and inoculate the next batch with it to keep a yeast alive over a longer period of time. It wasn't unusual for people to float a piece of toast on the top of a mead or a drink to get some yeasts from there, or spread some balm on some toast and float it in your drink. So long as you've got a source of a yeast, you're going to get your alcohol and your carbon dioxide, and it's all going to be on for young and old. Really, as I say, it's a very straightforward recipe. Honey and water, and something to ferment it in. So I use a couple of stainless steel pots, measure out my honey, I warm it up to help dissolve it into some water in my pots. Mix in any, if I'm going to do metheglins with herbs and spices, I'll add those during that process. So traditionally people talk about boiling it up and skimming off scum off the top. I think this is more likely that they just weren't as good as extracting the honey from the wax and bee legs and bee bits. And I tend not to do that in a modern sense. The honey is usually pretty good. It's been spun out of the combs, and it comes to me in a very good form usually. Warm it up so it dissolves, and then once things have cooled down a bit, pour it into a modern brewing vessel. I add a yeast. I have a particular yeast that I like to use from my local brew shop, and I do add a little bit of a yeast nutrient because honey, people talk about its sort of antiseptic properties and things, and that can make it a little bit hard for a yeast to establish itself in a honey water mix. So a little bit of yeast nutrient to help it kick along is a plus, and definitely something I do almost every time. Now that I have the process sort of down pat, that process of dissolving the honey in water, it's really an afternoon's work, and I have a tendency to let that cool down overnight, and then I will put it into the vat, top up the vat to the level that I want, make sure that it's as sweet as an opening liquid as I want it to be, and then add the yeast, seal it up. So the making process, where you're sort of kind of cooking things, that's, a day. I do it over 2 days to have that convenience of letting it cool overnight. If you have the technology, you might cool it deliberately. You can get modern equipment now that helps you cool things to a certain temperature. The make, in terms of put it all together, only a day or so. When it comes to how long does it take to brew, I'm very patient when it comes to mead, and I will let it brew in the vat for a lengthy period of time. The active period, where the yeast is alive, producing carbon dioxide and producing the alcohol, is probably only a few weeks. Mead, once again, can be a little slow because the honey's properties can slow the yeast down. So my tendency is to leave things alone. One of the batches that I like to make each year, I make effectively a vintage each year. It stays in the vat for the year, and then there's like a 2-day intensive process where I do a bottling of the year and clean, sterilize, prepare, and I then roll straight into the next one. That particular recipe that I'm talking about is a fruit one. It's a melomel. And the advantage is that I also use oak chips inside my brewing barrels. The brewing barrel's modern plastic, and I'm trying to simulate things that were made in earlier times. And so you want that oaky goodness, and because sometimes that can produce a little bit of floaties in your brew, it's helpful to let it all settle out. The yeast, as it's working, produces a waste product which looks like a horrible brown paste, and it's nice that that's settled to the bottom of your vat. Oftentimes people will siphon off that product to the bottom, referred to as the lees. I'm lazy and patient, so I have a tendency to leave it alone, let it all settle out. Over a year, anything floating that's wood will waterlog and sink, and then you just siphon the good stuff off the top into the bottles. I have had a great deal of success using local markets, so if you're near a farmer's market or something like that, certainly discuss with them what your needs are. I do make batches in reasonably large sizes, and I'm often negotiating with vendors, sort of saying, I'm going to buy 10 kilos, I'm going to buy 25 kilos, can we do a better price? How would you like to do that? So that's been very, very successful over the years, and some of those honeys have wonderful flavours which impart an additional something into the brew that you make. Recently I've been purchasing in quite large quantities from a wholesaler in Brisbane, and that's been very, very good. But I do participate in online forums where occasionally people will offer honey for sale. Only yesterday I saw that there is a person in a township just to the west of me who has been awarded for their honey, and they're offering for sale if I buy in large enough quantities. And I have a couple of buckets, and I'm thinking pretty seriously of getting in contact with this person and buying a lot of honey. Yes, it does, because the honey does impart its own flavours, and as I'm sure many people who've tasted honeys from different places have found that they can be quite distinctive in their flavours. And I'm always very careful because the brewing process enhances those flavours. So very strongly flavoured honeys you need to take care with. It can produce incredible outcomes, but it might not be to everybody's taste. So I have a tendency to look for milder honeys, light honeys, ones that flow easily, are easier to work with when you're trying to dissolve it. But I've tried quite a few things over the years. I had some success a couple of years back with a very dark honey, very, very dark, very strong flavour. But I made a methylene with that, and the strong flavour of the honey along with that was the ginger and rosemary one that we talked about earlier. That combination was excellent and it worked really, really well. Yes, mead stores very, very well, and often if you're making your own mead and you sort of taste it early on and sort of go, oh, I'm not sure that I like that, put it away, leave it alone. I have meads on the rack here that are 20 years old. It keeps very, very well. You know those properties that people speak of as honey being so useful and helpful in preserving things? Absolutely, even though it's in an alcoholic beverage, it's keeping really, really well. And it changes over the years. I think the oldest is currently from 1997, so we're doing the maths at 23. Yeah, so yeah, not much of that left anymore.